Set 8. Palmer had just finished supper on Monday when the doorbell rang. It was the guys. "Let's go," said Beans. "Where?" said Palmer. "School, come on. It starts in 10 minutes. Beans grabbed Palmer's wrist and pulled him down the front steps. Was this some kind of joke? "School?" said Palmer. "School's over." "Not this school." They were trotting. Beans still had his wrist. Palmer pulled himself free. "What school?" They were heading toward the park. "Where are we going?" Beans' eyes lit up. "Wringer School." Palmer felt walloped. He jerked to a halt. Suddenly his throat would not work. He could not speak. Everyone stopped. Beans said, "What's the matter?" Palmer rasped, "Nothing." "Ain't you coming to Wringer School, snots?" said Muddo. He was leering. "Don't you want to learn how to ring pigeons?" said Beans. He moved his fists as if he twisted a wet towel. "Don't you want to learn how to wring their necks?" Henry was looking away. Beans was in his face. "You hate pigeons, don't you?" Palmer nodded. "Sure." Muddo's eyes were scanning the sky. Beans thumped his shoulder. "So let's go." They ran. That was the worst of it, the running. "What am I doing?" Palmer kept thinking, but his legs ran on. At the soccer field, a mob of kids was gathered around a man with a neon pink baseball cap. The man who had been waiting for Palmer for 10 years. The ringmaster. "You stay out of the way," he was saying, calling really, so everyone could hear. "Each shooter gets 5 shots at a time. Count them. Until the last one, you don't move. You stay here." He pointed to the ground at his feet. "Right here. And where are your eyes all the time?" "On you," piped half a dozen voices. The man nodded. "That's right. I'm easy to find, easy to see. I guarantee nobody else is going to be wearing a hat this ugly." Giggles. "So, you're listening for the 5 shots and watching me, and when I go like this," he lifted the pink hat and waved it. "That's your signal. You move. Fast. 3 of you. You move in groups of 3. First man gets the empty bird box and takes it," he pointed, "over there. So they can load her up again with 5 more birds. The other 2, you're moving out onto the field. Fast. Everything you do is fast." He replaced his hat. He looked over the group. "What's the magic word, man?" Everyone, including Palmer, yelled, "Fast!" The man paused, then whispered, "Why?" For a long time there was no answer. Then a mild, uncertain voice spoke. "There's so many pigeons?" The man snapped his fingers and pointed to Henry. "Bingo! There's 5,000 birds, man, and only 1 day to turn them into fertilizer. Every dead birdie means $5 to maintain this here park." "Anybody here don't play in this park?" No hands went up. He shrugged. "There you go. It's for you. You're helping yourself." He looked them over. "Any questions?" Palmer had a million, but he asked none, nor did anyone else. The man nodded. "All right, last item. Ringing the bird." A cheer went up from the crowd. The man held up something. Another cheer. The something was gray, perhaps once a large sock. It was stuffed to plumpness, most of it, with a narrow neck ending in a golf ball-sized head. "Stunt pigeon," someone called out. Everyone laughed. The man stared sternly. "Get your giggles over with now. There'll be no giggles on the 7th of August. No horsing around. Anybody that's not all business," he wagged his thumb, "you're out of here. Understand?" Capped heads nodded. "Okay now. The shooter's done. You're a team of 3. 1 of you's gone for the box. The other 2 zip onto the field. What are you going to find? One of 3 things. You're either going to find 5 dead birds, you're going to find 5 floppers, that's what I call the wounded, or you're going to find, and this will be most cases, a combination of the above. We got some sorry shooters in this town, and we got some real dead eyes, but most of them are in between." He raised a finger. "Back up a minute. If wounded birds are floppers, what do you call dead birds? He moved over the group. His eyes were twinkling. Someone up front said, Croakers? The ringmaster laughed. Trick question, son. The answer is dead. Dead is dead. There's no other word for it. He ruffled the kid's hair. All right. You're on the field. Each of you heads for a bird, and not the same bird. No fighting over who gets which bird. This ain't no Easter egg hunt. Giggles. All right. You come to your bird. If it's dead, fine. If it ain't dead, also fine. Whichever. You snatch it up, and you get the next one. Between the two of you, you're coming back with 5 birds. Here's where you check them out. You see one that's not dead. He swung his head slowly, looking at every face. You wring its neck. Palmer heard one stifled squeak. All else was silent. The man held the gray thing above his head. One hand here, and twist in opposite directions. You do it hard, you do it quick. We're not here to torture these animals. We're here to kill them humanely, hard and quick. That's all it takes. Into a trash bag. Go to the back of the line. Next time you're up, somebody else gets the box. Keep rotating. Everybody gets a chance. What's the magic word? Fast! He looked them over. Any questions? A voice came out of the crowd. How will you know if it's dead or not? Somebody yipped. Take its pulse! The man's glare cut off the laughter. The trees were silent. You'll know, said the man. The sky was empty. The man clapped. All right, line up. This here's a flopper. He held up the gray stuffed sock. I want each of you to step forward, ring it like I showed, and get out of here. I'll see you August 7th, 6 a.m. sharp. Let's go. The crowd formed a line. Palmer had notions of drifting away, but Beans and Muddle were herding him their way. As he waited in line, Palmer felt himself to be 4 years old again, at his first family fest, with the wounded, lopsided pigeon coming toward him, and the gray sour smell of the gun smoke growing stronger with every breath. He took his eyes from the field and fixed them on the pink-hatted ringmaster. He noticed how intently the man stared into the face of each kid who stepped up and took the sock. It seemed the man was on the lookout for pretenders, for kids who didn't really want to be there, for wimps. And if the man detected a wimp, what would he do? Would he cry out, "Aha!" and send the kid away to the jeers of the crowd? Would the kid ever be able to show his face in this town again? Ahead of him, Beans, then Meadow, run the sock. Like most of the kids, they really got into it, grunting with the effort, and now the man was holding it out to Palmer. Palmer accepted it. Beans' voice came from nearby. Ring it, Snots. Palmer could feel the man's eyes on him. He wondered how his face looked. Would the man say, "Aha!" Palmer had half expected the sock to sprout pink feet and glossy feathers. It did not. He wanted to call out to all the ringers in training. Hey, who are they trying to kid? This is no pigeon. You want to know what a real pigeon feels like? Ask me. This is nothing but a sock. Let's go, son, said the man. Hard and quick. Palmer wrung its neck, hard and quick. He dashed it to the ground at the man's feet and marched off. The man said nothing. Palmer caught the weightless, foamy basketball. He turned it in his hands to look at Nipper's name in broad marker strokes. He tossed the ball back to Dorothy. Nipper chuckled down at them from a curtain rod. If it was only a sock, said Dorothy, why do you keep worrying about it? Palmer got up and paced back and forth. I'm worried because in 13 days I'm going to be 10, and 28 days after that it's Family Fest, and then it won't be a sock anymore. No one spoke for a while. Nipper flew to the basket rim. Palmer paced. At last Dorothy said, Tell them. Palmer looked at her. Huh? Tell them. Tell them what? You don't want to be a ringer. You're not going to be a ringer. Palmer stared. Tell who? Dorothy stared back. Suddenly a huge grin broke across her face. She threw out her arms. Everybody! Palmer glared at her. He sneered. Yeah, right. Dorothy jumped down from her usual perch on Palmer's desk. Okay then, she said. How about if I tell them? She bolted from the window. She threw up the screen, leaned out over the porch roof, and yelled, Hey, everybody, I have an announcement! Palmer yanked her back into the room and slammed down the screen. He stood red-faced, fuming. Dorothy wiggled and giggled out of his grasp and went to play with Nipper. Palmer shut the window and locked it. He pulled down the shade. But he could not shut out the cold, wet feeling that he had just peeked into his future. When he turned back to Dorothy, he found her wearing an impish grin. So, she said, are you going to invite me to your birthday party this year? Palmer sighed. He'd been dreading this. So far, his social life had been neatly divided into two separate relationships, one with Dorothy, one with the guys. Dorothy herself helped keep it that way by avoiding him whenever the guys were around. Last year, except for his mother's complaint, it had been fairly easy not to invite Dorothy. This year was hugely different. Dorothy was now his best friend, and the only person in the world with whom he shared Nipper. How could he not invite her? And how could he not invite the guys? Well, said Dorothy, maybe I won't even have a party, he said. But he knew he would, because the guys were already talking about it. They were expecting it, and because his strategy for surviving the summer was simply this: stay on their good side. It was becoming harder and harder to do, for in these recent weeks, Palmer had come to realize that, with the possible exception of Henry, the guys whose company he had once craved, he now feared. If they ever found out for sure that he was a traitor, Farquhar's treatment would feel like babies playing compared to what they could do. He imagined them torturing him until he led them to his forbidden pet. And at that point, Nipper was as good as dead. So when his mother at dinner one day said, Do you want a party this year? Palmer's answer was yes. After a long pause, his mother said, Okay, but you have to invite Dorothy too. Palmer just shrugged and nodded. Sometimes the effort of getting through each day left him feeling heavy and dopey for dinner time. He wished he could just go to bed and not wake up until September. And then his mother, sprinkling salt on a baked potato, said ever so casually, You don't happen to know anyone looking for a lost cat, do you? Instantly, Palmer was alert. No, why? Oh, she said, I've noticed one around the last few days. Did a spider just walk across his shoulders? Around where? Backyard, around the side. That was yesterday. Today I found it inside on the stairway. Palmer's heart pounded in his chest. What color? Yellow, she said, reaching for the pepper. She said more, but he was not hearing. He was racing upstairs, bursting into his room, finding Nipper healthy and plump, and waddling across the floor to meet him. He fell to his knees and pounded his fist again and again into his thigh. Although she insisted that she would be there right up to the last minute, Dorothy did not come to Palmer's birthday party. Neither did his mother. I'll leave your father to deal with your hoodlum friends this year, she said, and went off shopping. The guys were thrilled. They had learned about the sharpshooter award, and to them Palmer's father was as big a hero as a battlefield general. They kept running back to the den to look and touch the trophy. They flung questions. Is it real gold, Mr. LaRue? How many pigeons did you shoot? Can we see your gun? At the dining room table, Beans gave a speech about himself, about his hatred of pigeons, and how many necks he intended to wring. He called to Palmer's father, who was in the kitchen planting candles in the cake. I bet you hate them dirty birds even more than me, don't you, Mr. LaRue? Palmer's father came to the doorway. He looked directly at Beans, and he smiled. No, he said. I don't hate pigeons. Never did. He returned to the cake. The empty look on Beans's face indicated that the answer had reached his ears, but no farther. He called, You were a ringer, right, Mr. LaRue? I was. And now Snots is too, huh? How about that? The reply from the kitchen came after a long pause. Palmer decides for himself. It's up to him. Palmer gaped at the doorway as Beans thumped his fist on the table and growled, "Where's the grub?" Like everyone else, Palmer ate his ice cream and cake, but he wasn't hungry. He opened his presents, but did not enjoy them. On this day that he had dreaded for so long, he had no appetite for anything. As everyone belted out, "Happy birthday!" Palmer stared at the man marching in with the cake and tried to imagine him pulling the trigger again and again as gray feathered nippers fell from the sky. The cake was placed in front of him, and Palmer found that he could neither move nor breathe. The heat from the 10 tiny fires burned his face. In the plump, shimmering shapes of the candle flames, he saw the ghosts of 10 pigeons. "Blow 'em out!" someone squawked. Palmer squeezed his eyes shut and blew them out. Outside, after the party, they went in search of Farquhar. When Palmer recalled last year's treatment, he could hardly believe his own memory. Pride, honor, little kids lining up to touch his devastated arm. True, last year he felt the same terror that he felt now, but he knew that after Farquhar's 10 knuckles this year, no pride, no honor awaited him, only pain and uselessness. To his great relief, they could not find Farquhar. At dinner time, the boys split up and Palmer returned home alone. He fed and played with Nipper. He did not feed himself. He received a happy birthday phone call from Dorothy. Dusk was falling outside when a twinge of hunger sent him to the kitchen. He found the leftover cake, covered and sitting atop the refrigerator. He got it down. He set it on the table. He lifted the cover and gasped aloud. Finger lettered in the chocolate icing along the side of the 2-layered cake was a single word: tonight. Henry. Thinking back, Palmer recalled that as the gang was leaving the house that afternoon, Henry had rushed back in, claiming he had forgotten something. Henry, whose streak, unlike Beans, was meek, not mean. Who ran with Beans and Mutto, who did what they did, but was different. Who Palmer had seen one day pulling his little sister around the block in a wagon. Henry had done it. Fingered the word into the icing. Tonight. It was a warning. Something was going to happen tonight. Something not good. But what? As he smeared over the word with a dinner knife, Palmer thought about it. The only place that he could be at night would be in his room, in bed. If something bad were going to happen to him, that's where it would have to be. It must have something to do with Beans and Mutto, or the cat. The cat had already been slipped into the house. Maybe this time, tonight, they would slip themselves in. They had already done so once. And lately, Beans especially had taken an interest in Palmer's room. Palmer, acting put out with his parents, kept insisting he was not allowed to have visitors upstairs. This, however, had not prevented Beans from climbing the stairs to the bathroom, no fewer than 3 times during the party. Palmer considered phoning Henry to ask him directly, but that felt risky. Left to his best guess, he decided the warning meant that he was to have visitors that night. Considering the guys' recent suspicions, it did not take a genius to figure out that the purpose of this visit had to do with a certain feathered roommate. He went upstairs to feed Nipper, who had returned from his daily wanderings. While the pigeon pecked at nacho pieces, Palmer sat on the bed to think the whole thing through. It occurred to him that he could close and lock his window and thus keep them out. It was a simple solution, but it also created its own problems. Guys might keep banging on the window all night until Palmer answered. Foiled at Palmer's window, they might get in other windows. They might wake up his parents. And most important, with the window closed on a hot summer night and no one answering their taps on the pane, they might well become more suspicious than ever. No, the window had to stay open. He had to let them in. And that meant, of course, that Nipper could not be in the room. Neither could Palmer. He thought about it. They would go downstairs. They would hide in the dark. He did not think the guys would search the whole house. The target was his bedroom. And what could he say next day when Beans asked him where he was last night? He could say it was too hot in his room, so he slept downstairs on the sofa. Or even better, he stayed overnight at relatives. The moon was beaming outside his window when a happy thought came to him. This whole thing could turn in his favor. Once they saw for themselves that there was no pigeon or evidence of a pigeon, they might drop their suspicions. They might believe him. They might back off. So maybe, crazy as it sounded, it was good that they were coming. Palmer had no trouble staying awake in the dark. He was too nervous to sleep. At last, he heard his parents' footsteps coming up the stairs. 10 minutes later, the bright crack under his bedroom door went dark. He waited until he thought that they were asleep. He turned on the flashlight that he had brought up for the night. Nipper Up was at his usual spot on the closet shelf. When the light beam struck, the eye facing Palmer went from buttonhole slit to orange button. Otherwise, the bird did not move. This was normal behavior, Palmer knew. Nipper would be easy to handle. When he settled down to roost, he went into a dopey trance that firecrackers could not disturb. Palmer stood on a chair and, cupping his hands, gently lifted his forbidden pet from the shelf. Holding both pigeon and flashlight was tricky, but Palmer managed to tiptoe downstairs without waking up the house. At first, he sat on the sofa with Nipper in his lap. Still feeling unsafe, he went behind the sofa. He turned off the flashlight. In the utter darkness, he felt himself to be nothing but ears and fingertips. He could feel Nipper's heartbeat, putting away behind the toothpick ribs like a tiny motor scooter. He could feel the cold, golden gaze of the trophy pigeon 2 rooms away. The silence of the house at night was not total. Somewhere a clock was ticking. Cricks and creaks came from nearby and distant quarters, as if the house were twitching in its sleep of its own. Palmer tried to aim his hearing upstairs. He held his breath as long as he could. Listening. Was that a window screen opening? A footstep? He pictured them in his room. Shadows, dark upon dark. Beans pinlight, like a star flake, moving in the darkness, pointing at the bed. He's not here. Pointing under the bed, shining on the bookshelf, the basket rim, the desk, the closet shelf, the empty closet shelf, the closet. Oh no, the closet floor. The honey crunchers. He had forgotten to bring them downstairs. Would they see them? Would they figure the cereal was Palmer's or for snacking? Or would they guess the real reason? He thought of going up because maybe they were not there. Racing up the stairs, grabbing the cereal box, racing back down. 10 seconds was all he needed. He could do it. But what if they were there? What if that creak that he just heard? He stayed put. He crouched and cringed behind the sofa as if neither furniture nor darkness were enough to hide him. He stayed through 1,000 talks of unseen clock, and another 1,000, and the bonging of his heart, and only when he heard from behind the house 2 sharp, quick yelps did he know for absolutely sure that they had been there. And even then, he waited for another 1,000 talks before he allowed himself a deep breath and last sleep. He awoke to Nipper pecking his ear, and just in time. His father, earliest bird in the house, was coming down the stairs. He scooped up his pigeon and crouched behind the sofa. When his father passed into the kitchen, he dashed up the steps and into his room. Glancing around, he saw no evidence of night visitors. The window screen was firmly shut. Everything was in its place, except one thing, and he soon found out. He hadn't even had breakfast yet when the doorbell rang. As soon as he opened the door, he found himself facing the Nerf basketball. Curling around it were Beans' fingers. Who's Nipper? Palmer could not think fast enough. Beans pressed the ball into Palmer's nose. Who wrote this? He did not want to get Dorothy involved. I did, he said. So who is Nipper? Palmer blurted the first thing that came to mind. Me. It used to be my nickname when I was little. He looked at them all. Before I knew you guys? Motto stepped up beside Beans. We think Nipper's a pigeon. Palmer made a shocked face. Pigeon? What would I do with a pigeon? What would you do with that cereal and nachos that you put in your room? Said Beans. Palmer laughed, showing them how wrong they were. Snacks? I keep stuff in my room so I don't have to go all the way down to the kitchen. He wanted to kick himself for forgetting about Nipper's food. And where were you last night? Said Beans. It occurred to Palmer that he had a right to question of his own. Where was I? Where were you? He glanced at Henry. Henry's face showed nothing. Where did you get my ball? Beans grinned. We came to see you last night. You weren't there, said Meadow. Palmer nodded. I know. I was sleeping overnight at somebody's. My cousin's. I wasn't here. Henry staring at the sky. Palmer saw Henry for what he was. A captive, strong enough to warn him about last night, but too weak to do anything except follow Beans. He saw in Henry something of himself, and worse, what he could become. Beans scowled at the ball, at Palmer. You ain't Nipper. You're Snots. He dropped the ball to the ground and stepped on it. When he raised his foot, the foam ball reclaimed its roundness. Beans cursed and stomped on the ball with both feet, flattening it, grinding it into the sidewalk. For a full minute, he grunted with the effort, and again the ball popped back to shape. He kicked it away. He yanked on Palmer's arm. Let's go. We gotta find Farquhar. They found Farquhar in front of the deli, eating chocolate cupcakes and drinking Coke. Beans announced, pointing to Palmer. Birthday boy, 10 years old. Slouched against the deli window, Farquhar took a swig of Coke. He switched it around in his mouth. He raised his upper lip, giving himself a rodent-like face, and spent a thin stream of Coke between his front teeth. The boys shot backward. Farquhar peered at Palmer. Wringer, huh? Palmer did not answer. He needs the treatment, said Beans. Farquhar glared. You rushing me? Beans spread his arms. No, I'm just saying. Farquhar bit a cupcake in half. Chocolate icing covered his teeth. What's it look like I'm doing? Eating, replied Beans tentatively. Eating breakfast, said Farquhar, washing down his mouthful with Coke. The boys took another step back. You don't say nothing while I'm eating breakfast, you understand? All four boys nodded. They retreated to the curb, and they sat down facing the street, not daring to even look at Farquhar. After a long time, they heard his voice. Okay, they turned. He was walking up the sidewalk. They got up and followed. He turned into an air shaft between two storefronts and went back to the alley. He stopped. He backed away from them, making space. All faces were grim. No one spoke. Farquhar pointed to the ground in front of him. He looked into Palmer's eyes. Step up. Palmer stepped up. Right or left? Left. Roll it up. He rolled his left sleeve up to the shoulder. He blinked several times. He looked around. He rolled his sleeve back down. He took a step back. He shook his head. Farquhar's brow pinched in surprise. What? No, said Palmer. The word came out choked and dry. No, said Farquhar. Chocolate crumb was wedged between his front teeth. No, said Palmer, clearly this time. He heard shuffling behind him. No what? No what? Palmer moved away from them all, facing them all. They stared at him, waiting. He saw the foot grinding the ball, the name into the sidewalk. He heard the scream, heard it coming a split second before the others heard it. The scream that he knew now had been growing inside him for a long time. He planted his feet and he bent his knees and balled his fists and he let it come all the way out. No, nothing! No treatment, no ringer, no snots! He thrust his scream at Beans. I'm not Snots. My name is Palmer. My name is Palmer. He stepped back. He hunkered down. No! Then he ran. Down the alleys, down the streets. He ran like he had never run before. If Farquhar was with them, he would be caught. He knew that. But if not, he might be able to outrun the guys. He heard their sneakers slapping the pavement behind him. He heard their calls. You're a dead meat, Snots. I'm gonna eat that pigeon of yours. I'm gonna wring its neck and pull its head off. I'm pulling your head off. He ran and ran. A bug crawled down the middle of his back. He tried to reach it. He wiped off his shirt, ran a fingertip up his spine. It wasn't a bug. It was sweat. The sun boiled in a cloudless sky. The dumpster had been slowly reeling in its shadow, so that he now had to sit with his back flat against it and his knees drawn up in order to remain wholly in the shade. The dumpster's metal flank felt cool and crusty against his bare back. His breath and heartbeat had long since returned to normal. The noontime music of church bells had passed an hour ago, maybe two. He was hungry, thirsty, but also safe. The only other safe place being his own house, which was exactly 5.5 blocks from the dumpster behind the great grocer supermarket. A back door slammed open. Out came a worker dragging 2 hugely swollen black plastic bags. Seeing Palmer said, "You waiting to help me?" Was the man joking? He wasn't smiling? No, answered Palmer. With a grunt, the worker heaved one bag, then the other into the dumpster. He looked down at Palmer. He wagged his head. Made in the shade. He went back inside. 5.5 blocks. In his head, Palmer plotted a course that, except for the final half block, kept him in alleyways. Even so, streets would have to be crossed in broad daylight. And anyway, the guys themselves took alleys as often as streets. They could be anywhere. Around any corner, behind any parked car. They could be in front of the green grocer right now, asking people, "Did you see a kid?" They might already be spreading word around town. "Palmer LaRue has a pigeon." He knew that if that fact had ever been in question, the question had been answered spectacularly by his actions of the morning. The back door slammed open, and the worker came out. But this time there was nothing in his hands but a can of Sprite. He stopped in front of Palmer and held out the can down to him. It hadn't been opened. "You look like you need this, kid." It occurred to Palmer that this might be some kind of trick, but he was too thirsty to care. He took the can. It felt blessedly cold. He stared up at the man. He felt like crying. The man's lips almost smiled. "On the house," he said, and he was gone. Palmer snapped open the Sprite and drank the can empty, taking time out only to gasp for breath. He lay his head back against the dumpster and closed his eyes. In spite of himself, in spite of everything, for a precious few seconds, he felt good. His first idea had been to wait until dark, then make a run for home. As the sun dropped below the roofline of the great grocer, he began to see that the idea was bad. Nipper would be coming home soon, and who could say that they were not waiting for him? Maybe even on the porch roof itself, with stones, slingshots. Suddenly it was clear. He had to get home before Nipper. Now, he dropped the can and ran. Alley and street, he took the fastest way, driven by images of Nipper flying into a blizzard of stones. As he approached the turn onto his block, it occurred to him that they might be waiting at his front door. It occurred to him that this might be his last minute on Earth. He slowed down and thought of Nipper and ran on. They were not there. He burst into his house. He wanted to collapse right then and there, to rub his face in the living room rug, but he dared not stop. He took the stairs 3 at a time, flung open the door. Nipper was at the window, on the sill outside the screen, and inside, sitting on his pillow, was the yellow cat Panther, facing the window, its head as still as statue, its tail sweeping slowly from side to side. It hadn't even bothered to look at Palmer. The closest thing was a comic book. Palmer hurled it. The cat hissed, screeched, leaped to the floor, and was downstairs before Palmer finished his scream. It was then, as he opened the screen to let Nipper in, that he knew his pigeon must go.